So welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here, notwithstanding the fact that it's 4 o'clock on day 2. So well done, well done. And we're going to be talking about communicating economic data and statistics, which no matter how expert you are in a room, I'm sure you all feel the same pressure in a sense to be able to communicate the work you're doing to a mixed audience. I'm Sam Beckett. I'm second permanent secretary at the Office for National Statistics and co-head of the government economic service. And I'm absolutely delighted to get the opportunity to bring together a really fantastic panel to kick us off for a discussion that I hope you will be very active participants in. So we have with us today Owen Brace. He's Director of Communications at the Office for National Statistics. So Owen is working really hard on at the moment on thinking about communication of the once-in-a-decade census, but also thinking about how we massively improve our own website. We have two data journalists from The Economist. Welcome to James Fransham. You're a data journalist at the Economist data team in London, as well as writing on a graphic detail section. You do lots of original quantitative pieces for The Economist. So welcome, looking forward to hearing from you. And Ainslie Johnstone, you've recently joined The Economist as a data journalist. And Ainslie's background has been in neuroscience, and she worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the UCL Institute of Neurology. So that's a nice angle on today's issue of communication. But finally, Johnny Runge is going to kick us off with 10 minutes on his work around qualitative methods of seeing how well and how we can better communicate economics and economic measurement. Johnny is the principal social researcher at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and he's going to take us through a variety of the findings and research that he has been doing over recent years. So I'll hand over to you, and then the panel will kick us off, and then I'll invite questions from the floor. Johnny.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, I'll focus on one particular audience that we are communicating to the wider public, and particularly based on this work that we have done on public understanding of economic statistics. So I think I counted it yesterday. So as part of these projects, we've spoken to more than 300 people now as part of interviews and focus groups, and also done online surveys. And the findings are quite consistent in the sense that we are finding some of these misperceptions and the lack of knowledge that the public have about different economic definitions, different economic issues, the size of different indicators, and also issues about data collection, measurement, and so on. But what we have also found, and that's probably got a bit lost in some of the debate around these studies, is that we've also seen a lot of kind of insightful and really rich, nuanced understandings among the public. So that's particularly about people's own personal economy, and people kind of coming from a different perspective on some of these things than we are as economists. So we have this picture where there's a very big difference between people's kind of understanding of abstract national issues compared to their knowledge about their personal economy, personal impacts, and their personal finances, and so on. Another consistent finding, which is also in the kind of like wider literature on this, is that the public are quite frustrated often about how the economy is communicated to them. They feel like a lot of economic jargon is used, and they feel it's quite off-putting, and kind of like say that that's when they kind of like change channel on the evening news. So how do we improve this? Obviously, the kind of like obvious thing is to explain better. So I just wanted to like kind of highlight a couple of the studies that we have out here in the UK. So the Bank of England for a couple of years ago did a really useful report using online experimental surveys, kind of trying out different versions of their monetary policy report, you know, different language, different lengths, different visualizations, and trying to make it more or less relatable to people's lives. And they find that, you know, you can improve comprehension, engagement, trust, and stuff like this among the general public when you do some of these things. And that led them to publish a shorter, more accessible, more engaging, more kind of like everyday version of their monetary policy report. They've also done things like the knowledge bank, where there's a lot of like kind of like very simple explanations of things around the economy. We have kind of like replicated this work at the moment, which will be published fairly soon, using the ONS labor market overview, and we have kind of like come to similar findings. The other thing is there's obviously the kind of like practical aspects, you know, kind of the work that's being done every day in terms of communications by organizations like the ONS and other economic organizations, and obviously lots of learnings and strengths to build on, and especially from the pandemic where these things have been done really well. I just want to like kind of highlight what's the impact of explaining better in terms of the wider public. There's kind of two ways that if we do more accessible, more engaging outputs as economic organizations, that can kind of reach the general public. One of them is that people actually see these outputs directly. They somehow end up on the Bank of England or ONS website or whatever and see it. And if they are more engaging, these outputs, and if they are you know, more accessible and stuff, that will improve public understanding. So the question there is, if we have these accessible outputs, how do we get a larger proportion of the public, not just the engaged parts, but also, you know, the less engaged and less knowledgeable parts? How do we get them to engage directly with our outputs? And that's something people are, you know, we see this in focus groups and in interviews, and we see it in other studies as well, that this is something people really want. They want to speak to economists directly. They want to speak to the ONS. And, you know, as we heard in the kind of first lecture yesterday from Sir Charles Bean, you know, there's a big trust in the ONS kind of relative to some of the other messengers, the government, politicians, media, and so on. So there really is an appetite to get this direct communication and to receive that directly. But realistically, a lot of this information will get through various intermediaries, different research organizations, different economists, and like quite often the media, which is great. Like journalists, that this is what they're like, you know, specializing in, translating complex things to the public. But we also need, I think, as an economist community, to think about how do we kind of like improve this mechanisms of our outputs going to the media. How do we, you know, how do we help journalists, and if we make our outputs more accessible, does that kind of filter through to the way the media kind of like subsequently report our outputs? And here, remember, I'm not just talking about kind of the national experienced, kind of like very economically experienced journalists, also talking like local journalists reporting on local issues and so on. We've done some work on that in our current reports as well. Yeah. There's also education, you know, similar to explaining. We also need to educate better, and that's not just for universities A levels. It kind of starts, should start, if you want to reach the wider public, it should start earlier than that. But in my view, I mean, obviously those good things are good, but they are also what the literature calls top-down approaches. It's basically kind of identifying a problem that we think the wider public are ignorant. They don't understand the economy in the same way as we do. and then we try to kind of like bring them closer to our like kind of perspective as economists. And that's kind of like missing one of the key findings of our studies and others, that actually people have a good understanding of the economy, the personal impacts, their personal economy. They have very rich and nuanced understandings in some bits, and we need to play to that. You know, they are I think Sarah Connor from the FT put it when she covered this report. She put it that they're the people who live and breathe the economy every day. And we need to kind of like learn from those perspectives. So science has done this really well, very successfully for quite some time, done more bottom-up approaches, where they've kind of like engaged with the public on more equal terms, like listening as much as lecturing, and kind of like trying to understand from the economist perspective, what you know, where is it the public understand and misunderstand our subject. So we have done some like in kind of some, I guess we'd call pilot studies, like in kind of small scale studies, bringing economists and statisticians from like across different organizations into conversations with the general public. This Bank of England have done it on a much larger scale through the citizen panels. There's some differences between those two and some kind of like advantages and disadvantages of each approach. The reason I think we should engage more with the public as economists, and not kind of like let our comms teams and our journalists and so on like kind of do this exclusively, is that it brings us closer to the public's perspective. Like people told us that, who were part of our studies and the Bank of England studies, that it get us out of our own bubbles. It brings us closer to public perspective, and it doesn't only kind of help us explain and communicate better. I think an important thing to consider is as well that it helps us actually understand our own subject area better. So I think the kind of like recent debate with inflation and personal inflation, and Jack Monroe's kind of like contribution to that debate really illustrates this really well. It's something that came up again and again in these workshops, that economists and statisticians who participated in them afterwards were really like, we need to communicate that the way we're communicating inflation at the moment is very aggregate level. It's kind of for the Bank of England, but these things are really interesting to the public and really relatable, but how can we communicate it better? So it's not just about communication, basically. It's also about, actually, we can learn a lot about what we measure, how we measure, to make that relatable. So I think that's my bit. Yes, yeah.
Join me here. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Johnny. It was really a great opener. So I think to get us started, I'm just going to ask the other panelists to reflect a little on what they've heard, but also their personal experience in seeking to communicate economics and statistics to the public and indeed other consumers. I'm particularly interested in this public question, though, because I think we feel it very keenly at the Office for National Statistics, and the ultimate consumers, obviously, of the expertise represented in this room is the public. We're trying to make the citizens' life better in many respects, but also this question of trust, I think, is really key as well. And I thought, you know, some of the evidence presented on where that trust was moving and how differentiated it was for media, politicians, and civil servants was quite striking as well. So how do we get that reach, and how do we maintain trust? Be great to hear. I'm going to ask Owen to kick off, and you could start by introducing yourself again.
Yeah.
Hello, Owen, Director of Communications at the Office for National Statistics. And firstly, I'll probably say a lot of what Johnny's reported on there is experiences we've seen over a number of years in practice, as well as research we've done ourselves. So it's helped kind of shape the operations and the communications of the Office for National Statistics. I mean, conversation I had with Johnny as well is there's different scope and scale of what economists can achieve based on the organizations they work with. So some will have big expertise in data visualization, communications, media relations. Others will be having that direct contact themselves. So the principles, though, remain the same for me. If I start with the public, it's publics in my mind, because there is no one group, there is no single route to an audience. We're all broken down into different communities, different drivers, different characteristics. We all relate to different materials in different ways, and we can be reached in different ways as well. So there is, I mean, the first lesson, of course, is what there's no one size fits all. And so you really do need to think about how you're tailoring your material for your audiences. I think in terms of content, the way at the Office for National Statistics we tend to look at it is inform, explain, explore. So you've got your data, which the experts are going to go straight to and interrogate as they would want to. You've got your information through our headline figures and a little bit of detail behind that. Then you've got your explanation in terms of your analysis, your context. And we're experimenting with a lot more kind of styles of explanatory information there at the moment, be it through podcasts that we've just created, Statistically Speaking. If I can give it a plug, please find it on all your good platforms. But also just things like scrollytelling and long reads through mobile devices, which is where the majority of our users are going. And then into more of the exploratory work, which is the interactives, the maps, the tools, the interrogation that you as a consumer or people as a consumer will want to get to. And from a reach perspective, I think there's one thing to have in communications terms, your owned channels. So your website, your social channels, everything that you actively control, that carries a certain weight, but you're only going to attract the audience you can pull towards those channels. You need to go to the conversation where it's happening, which is the media, which is your third party, your advocates, your other organizations. And that brings the trust element into it, I think, as well, because the deliverer of the message is so important. ONS, we're fortunate, carries a relatively high level of trust and a relatively high level of awareness, I'd say as well. The questions are, if that deteriorates in different places, you've got to think about, is that an effective channel to use? Most people will get their news from peer groups, from community groups, from social, which is a growing area where people will get their news from. But it's, in social's example, it's the least trusted source of news as well. So the more people are getting the majority of their news from the least trusted sources. So therein brings another challenge around how people are engaging with the context and whether they believe the numbers they're being told. I'd also just mention timing. So for me, you can have the best content in the world, but if it's going out at the wrong time, no one's going to know about it, unfortunately. So it's really about, again, taking that debate and the discussion out to where it's most needed. We would have done a lot of work in the past on cost of living. It's important that we make sure that's going out again in this current discussion and current debate, because it's now that it's particularly relevant. So just because something isn't necessarily hitting the headlines on day one doesn't mean we don't have a use for it further down the line. And we've got to keep bringing audiences back to that as well. And then I'd probably just round off by talking about data literacy, because we as journalists, as communications, as economists, we can focus on what we can do now, but if you really want to change data literacy, you've got to look at generational changes. And I think the thing at the ONS is that we're trying to get that into primary education, secondary education, and then into further education as well. So just as an example, through the census, which has been a big platform for us, we have set up a Census in Schools campaign. So it's just introducing primary school children to numbers. Let's Count as the campaign. getting them more familiar with statistical concepts at a very young age to hopefully then progress through the education system. And those of you fortunate to go to Summit's event on measuring the economy, the ebook that we've got out, then takes that story forward for the more A-level plus kind of educated audiences on that side. So it's really about a generational change that you can make an effort now, but we're not going to really see the benefits for that for quite some years. Those are my reflections, I would say.
Thank you, and thanks for the plug on the on the ebook. I can see the team here smiling proudly. James,
yes,
would you like to reintroduce yourself perhaps briefly, and then give us your reflections?
Sure. Well, I'm one of two journalists here from the Economist magazine, so Ainslie and myself. But Ainslie and I have very different backgrounds. I have spent 13 and a half years at The Economist. I joined in January 2009 as a fact checker in the research department. And I did an economic undergraduate at Plymouth and then a postgrad MSc at Manchester. So I joined just after Lehman Brothers and the kind of depths of the financial crisis. And then I became a data journalist when it was kind of becoming a thing in 2014, 2015. So that was kind of Nate Silver was just getting famous. We're doing clever things with political science in America and things like that. So before that, obviously the Economist has done data journalism basically since it was founded in 1843. But we didn't call it data journalism. So like Pam Woodall's Big Mac Index, which is a really good illustration of teaching kids what PPP is. That was done in 1986. We didn't call it data journalism. So yeah, that's my background. So yeah, I think my reflection, I suppose, on Johnny's excellent presentation, and I dug into the depths of the reports, and they kind of make for slightly alarming and depressing reading. And I think my reflection is actually, and I was saying to Charlie Bean, I think earlier, or some others, that during my undergraduate, I didn't know really how unemployment was calculated. And they certainly didn't teach it me in my master's, which was basically pure mathematics. It was only when I started at The Economist that became, I had to know, like, how is the joblessness rate calculated? And so that comes to, as you were saying, education and actually teaching that stuff in schools. I don't think it's taught at all. There's a citizenship GCSE, but that covers constitutional stuff, and it's not compulsory. So, but I would say the COVID-19 pandemic was really good. Don't get me wrong, everyone. I much prefer if it didn't happen, but really good for data journalists. And there was a fascinating feature in the Times in December of last year, which the title was "Four. Look at the vital statistics on these lads." And it was like the grace and good of data journalism. And they published this in I think it was the Sunday Times, with kind of John Byrne Murdoch and Max Rosa from Our World in Data and Neil Ferguson and stuff like that. So, people, data journalists have been getting real exposure, which is good. And with that, though, that's reflective of the fact that stats have been really important for the past 2.5 years. Knowing what a logarithmic chart is kind of, I think Chris Whitty was basically started producing them. Not at first, but John Byrne Murdoch certainly, did a lot of those, and obviously The Economist did too. My mum got interested in stats, which is she's a really good litmus test for general population statistics. So and would say to me, well, what about the death numbers and on the BBC News, don't that number of people normally die in a day anyway? So she's getting at, obviously, excess mortality, which is really interesting. So I'm, the pandemic then has kind of led to this kind of, obviously, we're out of one crisis and into another. And I was saying to Ainslie earlier, like the inflation charts that we're now seeing look very similar, exponential growth, but very similar to those pandemic charts. So the kind of visual language which we're presenting the general public, which aren't normally used to seeing numbers in their day-to-day lives, are quite familiar. So we should piggyback on that kind of on a crisis and teach people really what stats are about, how we construct inflation. I think Johnny raised a really good point about Jack Monroe. I think you've got to question, like, ONS, with all due respect, like, what you're doing wrong if Jack Monroe is on Twitter questioning the credibility of your inflation stats and saying, I can do supermarket inflation and inflation for low-income households better than the ONS. And that's someone that has no resources and 200,000 followers or whatever it is on Twitter. So, and there's a lot to do, but there's definitely an opportunity.
Thank you. And Jack Monroe is now saying we're an organisation committed to getting things right. So, we dipped our toe with Jack Monroe, and with quite good results.
I might request a right to reply on that one at some point.
All right, but thank you.
Pleasure,
I think you're right about the recent times have got more people engaged with actually quite complicated measurement concepts, and we should capitalise on that. Over to you, Ainslie.
Yeah, so like James was saying, obviously there was, with COVID pandemic, a lot more interest in data journalism, and that was when I jumped on the bandwagon. So I've been at The Economist for almost a year now, but before that I was actually I was a research scientist for a while, working in neurology, which was really just a lot of statistics as well. And then now I've been at The Economist for around a year and writing on all sorts of different things, but always with the sort of data perspective, whether we're writing about, just some general trends in inflation figures or something like that, or doing our own analysis of whether going back to school caused an increase in COVID cases. It's a whole range of different topics. There was quite a few things in Johnny's talk that actually really sort of resonated with me. And things that I think since joining The Economist, I've sort of really thought a lot more about. And one of them, I think, was when you were talking about trust, Owen was talking about trust as well. And I think part of, I think when I first joined The Economist, and you're writing articles about something that is maybe quite complicated, a complicated index or a measure of something, I think that there's a temptation to just sort of gloss over where it came from, or gloss over sort of how this number was generated, because for fear that it's just going to be too difficult or too much for the person to understand. But I think that having some sort of context behind your figures, so this is an inflation index and it's calculated through a basket of goods that contain all of these different things, and you do often see that the inflation example in a lot of newspapers, but I feel like with a lot of other numbers, you do often sort of gloss over the nitty-gritty of how it was calculated, and I actually think that sort of detracts from it really. I think people trust in the numbers a lot more if they feel like, even at a sort of simple high level, they have some understanding of where they came from. So I think that's a really that insight really sort of resonated with me a lot. And the other one was talking about communicating with the public, and I sort of surprised to hear that wasn't really a part of the practice in economics, because from the perspective of science, my former life, my research was on stroke recovery, and we would have, I think it was quarterly meetings with stroke sufferers, and would talk about what really were the important issues for them. And I think it was just so helpful for us as researchers in guiding what were the most important questions for us to ask. Like you're saying, Jack Monroe obviously bringing up this idea that a lot of economists, hadn't just not really thought about before, because it's not something that a lot of economists probably experience. So that there's that. I think that there's just so much that can be gained from talking to people who have a different perspective from you. And the other one was again, the other thing you mentioned was the benefits as well to the researcher of I do think that actually trying to explain a complicated concept that you think about every day to another person without using jargon is actually a real challenge to your own understanding. I think very often our understanding of a concept, sometimes our misunderstanding or it is kind of masked to ourselves just from the jargon. We have an idea in our head of what this jargon word means, and we're confident using it and how we use it. And I think sometimes when you're actually forced to talk to someone without any jargon, it really, it sort of reveals to you where your areas of misunderstanding or lack of, like a real deep understanding lie, which, it's really interesting to me.
I very much agree with that. Nothing more challenging than trying to engage in your expertise with a member of the public. We should do a lot more of it, as you both highlighted. So everybody here has had a little go at their reflections and given you lots of food for thought. So I'm going to hand over now to take some questions from the audience. I think we've got roving mics to help you out.
Thanks so much for the talk, really interesting. Picking up what Ainslie just said, being able to explain something being a test of your own understanding. I used to work as a teacher in my previous life, so I know that far too well. If we're going to be engaging with schools and trying to get some of this economic stuff in schools, how are we going to disseminate our knowledge to the teachers? I suppose is the question, because if we can get the teachers to really understand it, then they can really help the students understand, and that improves everything moving forward.
Very good question. It's how we get that kind of pipeline understanding. And it's also worth noting, I think, that the teaching of economics at A-level in schools is very, very patchy. It's far more often taught in boys' schools than girls' schools. It's far more often taught in private schools than it is in state schools. So there are lots of challenges around that communication into the education system. But
Sam, can I ask why that is? Because economics is such a popular undergraduate degree. Why is it not taught at A-level?
Well, I think it is actually something in the lack of incentive for people to become economics teachers rather than economists.
Right, okay, yeah.
Because you're going to earn more money using that expertise. I think, I mean, that's a personal reflection rather than evidence. I think it is. Okay. I think that's got a lot to do with that. But would anyone like to come back? Would you like to comment, since it really addresses this point you made?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's difficult to know, what is going to be the best way to do these things. But I think, I mean, I'm sure a lot of the insights that came out of Johnny's report, like, trying to make things more visual, or, trying to just explain things with a bit of real world context and a lot more explanation behind it, really where these numbers come from and what they really mean and how to interpret them is probably the way to do it, I suppose. But I mean, I'm no education expert, so it's probably to say, I think.
Johnny, I think you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I mean, this is not really answering your question, but I mean, from my personal perspective, I think we have a tendency to kind of like focus on the education system and like how to educate children better and teachers better. I think what we kind of like hear and see in interviews and focus groups is that there is this kind of natural, people are not incredibly interested in the economy. They don't, the economy doesn't affect them when they're children, and that kind of like interest comes when you grow up and the economy starts affecting you in your personal life and stuff like that. So I think it's important that we don't get too focused on the early education stuff too much, because I think whatever we do there, and I'm sure we can do it better, I think it's very important to like kind of address the problem at the point where people are actually really interested and like kind of receptive to our explanations, engagement, whatever we do.
Thank you. Do you want to come in about the census? Does the census obviously has to go to schools?
So the principle around this really for us was co-creation. So it wasn't trying to say we're the experts in the numbers, therefore we're the experts in how this is landing with every audience. It's working with those audiences and the intermediaries. So with the census in schools, it was about working with teachers, representative teachers, specialist agencies who really understand that work, can help us shape what's going to land, particularly with those groups of children, and is going to resonate. So it's easy to have very worthy but quite dull information in curriculums. It's very hard to get engaging content, and we didn't try and reach too hard with it about trying to educate to a very, very high standard on numbers at a very early stage. It was just about introduction at that level. And if I can say that's probably a principle that the Office for National Statistics has tried with most groups. So we're trying to reach out to much broader than academic research, expert user areas, to work with the likes of third sector charities, others who don't necessarily have all of the data expertise, but working with them to say, well, what's going to work for your audiences? How can we co-create content? How can we present our data, our numbers in a way that's going to be most effective for you and most effective for your audiences and understandable? And it's, as I say, it's not one size fits all, it's different every time. And so you can almost go into an infinity pool of trying to create everything. So you've got to try and figure out from our perspective where we can make most impact, I think.
Thank you. Let's take another question. I'd like to go in. Joe. Thanks, Georgia.
Well, one comment and one question, really. The comment is I wanted to pick up on what Owen said about actually not this being ONS doing things to people, but actually ONS working with groups in various contexts to actually see how this can best work. And actually the book that you also mentioned, Owen, I think is a very good example of that. We were talking about it this morning at the session, that working with our audience there, which is essentially the undergraduate, graduate teachers, is going to be the way forward, rather than us ONS trying to impose something. The other comment I wanted to make is that I found one of the great advantages of having to think through how to communicate things is it was a very good quality control check. Because when you're trying to tell the story of what is this stuff ONS is putting out, if it doesn't really flow and it doesn't make sense as a story, it's a very good signal that actually something may be wrong. And actually, how does it fit in with what we put out last week or the week before? And is this really consistent? If not, well, think quite hard about it and think what's going on. So I think that sort of quality control aspect is something which is underestimated in the communications agenda. It's something I think which is really a really good external discipline on internal thinking, not just in communication, but actually what is it we're saying?
I definitely agree with that, and it sort of builds on Ainslie's point about trying to communicate it yourself, test your own understandings. That we've talked quite a lot about the kind of narrative. What about new and innovative methods of looking at data and interrogating data? Has anyone got thoughts or questions about that? You're stunned. Sorry, we'll start over here, but Richard and John, over to you.
The question that I wanted to ask was, you've spoken quite a lot about sort of interpreting maybe what people want, but what I was wanting to ask is how do you, especially if you're putting something out maybe that's new or experimental, how do you then evaluate that that's been successful, and how do you judge what's the sort of benchmark that you judge yourself against?
Very good question. I mean, and well, I'll turn to Owen to talk about how we try and clock how successful we've been.
It's a good question, because certainly with new and innovative content, it's sometimes the first time you've tried it. So it's about setting a benchmark for what good looks like and improving on it. So just relating back to Joe's point a little bit earlier as well is sometimes it's harder to write concisely and put something simply, so we just write longer and longer and make it more and more difficult to understand. But part of our metrics is looking at how much people go through bulletins, where they get to. The more you write doesn't mean the more people read. They still spend the same amount of time usually going through it. They just read less because you've made it too complicated. So from our perspective, we look at how much copy people are getting through, where their eyes are being drawn to on particular pieces of content. In terms of use, we look at through our own channels, what that looks in terms of numbers, in terms of reach about target audiences. So if we're trying to reach out to new audiences that we haven't reached before, are we managing to achieve that through either the channels, the media we go through, or through other areas? If I can give a bit of example back to James was talking about COVID as one of those kind of benchmarks for some of the copy. But one of the pieces we did was an interactive map on COVID deaths. And through our own channels in 48 hours, that had around 10,000 views. But we made it embeddable, and it was carried in most main broadcast and non-broadcast channels, and that turned it more into about 10 million views in about the same time. So that the power of being able to kind of embed and go through other channels and other voices was really, really valuable. Now we've got that now as a bit of a benchmark for future content, but a lot of the interactive, we're using it for the first time, really. It's about understanding that and measuring it, and then setting ourselves challenging targets for next, obviously.
Can I chip in on that? Because I think it's really interesting. The embeddable point is a good one, and Ainslie and I sit in a very privileged position insofar as that we sit on a 20-strong data team in a newsroom of 250 journalists around the world. We publish, basically 5 pieces among that data team a week. They're very thorough. And we're speaking to an audience who are extremely educated, often extremely rich, extremely knowledgeable. So it's not a big, we do technical stuff, but we do it well. Whereas pretty much every other newsroom, sadly, in the UK, with a few exceptions, obviously FT, Guardian being good ones at times, don't have the resources. They're trying to do data journalism, but they don't have the resources. So that's why having that embeddable content and making that stuff accessible. Because if you look at the Daily Mail's kind of sidebar of shame and you scroll down and you see, the kind of charts that they're lifting from, all and sundry. So if you have this embeddable content, they will use it, and they may editorialize around it as they see fit, but at least you're presenting the numbers in a kind of with the ONS gold standard. I think that's really important going forward, that you do more of that. We found a deprivation visualization that you've done, which is excellent, but doesn't have that embeddable bit. So that code needs to be everywhere. That's my I would insist upon. So
that's good feedback for us. But I think that was something you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Something else though, I was going to say it in reply to your question about knowing. You spoke a little bit about how many people it's reaching or how far people are reading through it. But I think something that James and I actually were just discussing earlier is I don't think really there's a good way to know whether people have really understood it. And we were just talking about, I said when I first joined The Economist, I was quite surprised to see that in our bar chart or in our charts, we would often have error bars and they'd be labeled as the standard deviation, which I thought was just, really quite a complex term. It's not really sort of evident from the name alone what that really means. Maybe 95% confidence interval sort of has a little bit more meaning to it, but of course, obviously the Economist readership is not the general public, but I realized that, I don't know where that really came from. I don't know if this was like a survey that where we now know that I'm sure if they see it enough times, they get the gist. But with a lot of our stuff that is a bit more, we're using more complex methods, or like James was saying earlier, we've used the word, we've used random forest in our articles a
I
number of
wrote this
times.
down actually. About 5 times, I think. Random
Yeah.
forest.
And
Yeah.
I think we don't really know whether people are really understanding it. Obviously, there's a bit of explanation, but I think that's something that probably we should do some research into, and I suppose it generalizes to other, the ONS as well. I guess I suppose there needs to be some research in that to really know.
Yeah, just to chip in on that, well, this is quite funny. There's one of our data journalists at the moment is on a crusade, and it's been a kind of 2-year campaign by him to get us to use more logarithmic charts. So log scales, okay, on anything that is basically an index. So even the S&P 500 should be on a log scale. But so the time is now kind of to do that, obviously, because there's a lot of resistance in the newsroom amongst the old crowd, let's say, who don't really understand log charts and wonder whether our readers understand them. So we're having a whole debate about, what's the visual language, what's the limits to people's knowledge and understanding, and making stuff accessible. So yeah, there's lots of trade-offs there, and we need to do more research. We do stuff at the Economist because we've always done it. So it's just habit, but we need to be better at using primary research to inform our decisions about how we communicate better.
No, interesting decisions on working out who your readership are and what they can cope with. But Johnny, I think you've wanted to come in for a while.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about. So obviously we do, and I've mentioned them in the presentation, we can do these experimental surveys and kind of like test out different versions and test out comprehension, engagement, trust, these kind of things. But that's in a kind of a artificial lab setting, an online survey where people kind of like have to read through it and stuff. They encounter it in a very different way in real life. They're busy, they have loads of things to do. They kind of just like see it, and whether they actually read it in the same way as in the online surveys is very questionable. So I think we need to be a little bit, we love doing these experimental stuff. There's some very strong findings coming from it, but how that actually translates to real life and real life engagement and how people understand it when they read it in that setting, I think is very interesting. But obviously with the kind of like page views and stuff, I was doing a seminar at the Bank of England Monday, and in their knowledge bank, they started kind of like with what is inflation, what is interest rate pages. Now they have moved on like recently to like, how high is inflation gonna go? How high is interest gonna go? And then put it in very simple terms. And they told me on some of those pages they've had over 100,000 views since they published it in the beginning of May. So it kind of like shows it. I mean, that is the crudest measure, I guess, where you can see when you're really capturing the public.
I think that's right. It's all important thing is what people are going to put in the search bar and whether you then come first. We should probably take another question.
Could I just come in very quickly? I mean, one immediate bit of feedback is social media, obviously. So if you're looking for immediate feedback on engaging content or understanding, then is something shareable? Is it getting kind of reach on that scale? But also, if you're tracking the conversation, are people understanding what's actually behind the numbers? And then are you engaging in the debate to correct if it's not being understood? Now, again, we're fortunate at the Office for National Statistics. We've got a network of statisticians who actively engage through their respective areas, whether it's on economics or others, to be able to monitor that, feed into that, and correct if it does go a little bit off or is understood in any area. So that's a really good immediate feedback from our perspective. But again, it's not something that everyone's able to do.
Thank you. We should perhaps take another couple of questions this time, and then we'll get sow a few seeds of different themes.
I want to make a comment that, sorry, forgive me, but I think that to some extent the title is slightly wrong. Because what we're trying to communicate is information of the state. And I think John is very good about that. With the Ainslie, I'd like to pick up on your comments, really, because it seems to me that information be more complex than data, at least for some people. And I think that you've got to give the context, you've got to give the detail. And I studied mathematics as a young man, and I found out that I didn't need to understand it in the first instance. If I read it and I read it again, and I would understand the question of learning about something is not necessarily the same as being taught about it. And I think it's very important to come back to, I mean, particularly the retail price index, sorry, the CPI and what's going on at the moment, that people need to understand more of the context and the information and less of the number. Sorry, just an observation.
Thank you. Let's take another one, and then we can get some reflections from the panel. Hi.
Thank you. You've touched on a number of different key themes, but I was just wondering if you could go across the panel and sort of answer, what do you think is the biggest barrier to better dissemination?
Thank you. Great question. Let's maybe take one more. This gentleman over here.
James mentioned fast-moving COVID data, which is engaging and accesses people quite quickly. I look after productivity statistics, which is the slow-burning car crash of British economics, and has been a problem for decades.
Is that how you communicate the challenge?
Absolutely. Sam mentioned innovation, and obviously over the last decade, we've tried lots of different ways of communicating this, whilst trying to keep that focus on that core issue. But I guess in very many areas of economics, the issues are quite structural. So it's how do you communicate them in a way which keeps them alive and keeps them in the public eye, even when they may be less newsworthy than a rapidly growing COVID spike.
Thank you. Very good. So we've got lots to reflect on there. I like the biggest barriers question. So please, if you've got burning thoughts on the panel about that one, I think it's an interesting thing about communicating, data as compared with statistics or analysis, perhaps, and the importance of context. And then how do you keep things in the public eye if they're more of a slow burn rather than a kind of crisis topic? A heartfelt plea from Richard Hayes there from the Office for National Statistics. Thoughts? Ainslie, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I take your point about information versus data. I think I'm just using those two terms interchangeably wrongly. On what is the biggest barrier? I think it's a difficult question. Perhaps I would say, perhaps a barrier certainly that I see may not be the biggest barrier, is that often people who are doing the original work in research in any field are not the same people who are communicating it, which in some ways is a good thing. But I think it's important for people who are doing research to have at least some sort of training in communicating their work. Because of course the communicators who are trained to do that, they will sort of only see the things that they're alerted to. And so I think that's definitely for sure a barrier, as I see it. Just forgotten.
Can I chip in on that as well? Because there's a really interesting body. If you need an expert scientist and you're a hack and you contact they're called the Science Media Center. Yeah. And they've been great throughout the pandemic, and they put stuff out in response to news or new data or whatever it might be. And you get comment, but if you basically want to know, anything about anything, you can contact this group and they'll come back to you and recommend an academic who will speak to you, which is great. As far as I know, you don't have anything like that for economics, but there should be something like that, because journalists are going to the banks, who may have an agenda, or they're going to, you know, the think tanks who also may have a political agenda, you know, getting decent commentary, I think, and having a centre like that for the economics profession would be awesome.
It's a very, very interesting suggestion. You can always ring the Office for National Statistics. We're here to serve. Johnny, have you got any comments on that suite
well,
of questions?
first of all, I mean, I've had a couple of really interesting and useful meetings with the Science Media Centre, and I mean, I think it should absolutely, we really should have an economics media centre. They also
set it up together as well.
They also do kind of like briefings when there's been some important stuff out. They kind of just do a briefing, invite like free people, like kind of independent people to kind of like explain that to journalists in simple terms. So yeah, they do a lot of good stuff. In terms of the barrier to better communication and dissemination and stuff, I wanted to come back to the trust issue and maybe kind of like go a little bit more negatively, because yes, we on surveys like the one we saw yesterday, there's big trust in the ONS and statisticians and so on, but it is a little bit more complicated than that. So the public and interviews and focus groups and surveys and stuff, they are not always aware of, you know, say unemployment statistics, who are kind of like, who are the source of that. There's a lot of people who think unemployment statistics, the kind of like headline figures are based on, you know, kind of like benefit stats or kind of like national insurance data and stuff. So they think, and they see quite often, they see unemployment figures being commented on the news by politicians, by government, that they don't trust. So there's kind of this assumption sometimes that these figures are coming from government, politicians, and so on. So I think that is a huge barrier. We are trusted, like ONS, economic organizations, and so on are trusted, but then some of our key outputs are not actually trusted because people don't know where it's coming from, how it's collected, and these kind of things. But what I would also say is then sometimes when you actually tell people how it's collected, you know, using the unemployment again as the example, if you go into too much detail, you know, it's the labor force survey, it's a very, in the public's view, a very small proportion of the population, then you get into a whole different kind of worms that can you know, again, erode trust. So it does become a bit messy. And you know, unemployment, just to finish that thing, I think the public would, you know, they think it's admin data based, these kind of figures, and that's probably, when you kind of explain the methodology, that's kind of what they would relate to quite naturally.
Yeah. So I think, well, Owen, have you got a biggest barrier that you want to contribute? And then I think we've got time for one more question.
Well, yeah, just to throw something different, I guess, is having data down to the granular level and then utilizing the tools to make the most of it. So if we back to Johnny's point from his research, that the general public, if we use that as one term, are interested in what it means for me. You know, what's personal experience from these data, these numbers, whatever it might be. But unless we have the data down to that level, unless we use those tools, like, for example, automation, to get out to the hundreds of regional titles that are out there, or the interactive calculators, so you can put in your own details and find out what that means for you as a household or as an individual, or maps where you're not set by a local authority level, you're interested more in this area which is relevant to me, and being able to draw your areas. Now, these are all parts that we're working on and others are working on, but it's not a default, it's not a matter of course for general outputs at the moment, and so we're not quite in the state where we can automate that whole system, and every output, every piece of information is interrogated by individuals in the way they would wish. So I think that's where we'd like to get to. Certainly, it's our ambition, but we're not quite there yet.
I think we're very nearly out of time, but we'll take one more question and then we'll have a quick fire from the panel members. That's this lady here.
There's a sort of a quote which is data isn't good or bad, but nor is it neutral. And there are kind of political decisions that are made implicitly. And I think this translates quite clearly when you do the communications. So for example, if you had an inflation figure of 3%, you would classically communicate that as high because we've got a 2% inflation target at the Bank of England, but that's not a rule of law. That was a political decision that was made in 1997. So how would you go about communicating that political decisions have been made in this process without losing trust in the statistics by the public?
Gosh, that's a tricky one for the last question. But, I mean, it does come back to the gentleman's point about context, I think, actually, as well. But very quickly, reflections, we'll just go down the line.
Well, I mean, obviously, this is what the ONS is. We build our reputation on being able to present information in independent, impartial ways. So the way we work is communications works with the outputs area and thinks through all the different ways numbers are going to be used. And then at the very start thinks, what context can we add in to prevent that from being used, either by accident or not? And it's a collaborative process from the outputs areas and the communicators, I think.
What's your 30? Thank you. What's your 30 seconds, James?
Inflation above target, I think, is the answer. But my 30 seconds is I think there's lots of work to do. Hey, there's lots and lots of work to do, and I think, you know, as someone who has some control over some agency at the Economist to kind of affect change there, there's more that we can be doing with getting our stuff out to kind of the A-level and GCSE schools. We have an Economist Foundation who are really good at teaching critical thinking to kids in deprived areas, particularly in London, which is great. And we're thinking of doing something along with statistics and data journalism and stuff. So there's stuff we can do in there. There's you know, I think if everyone got a free subscription to The Economist and that was in schools and they could look through the stats in the back, the indicator tables, which we still publish, I think that would be awesome. You know, making numbers more accessible, and obviously the internet has massively allowed for that, but there's definitely more on the kind of the curriculum and the syllabus needs to catch up with everything that we've been doing over the past 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you. Ainslie?
I feel like James probably covered a lot of the Economist view. I guess the one thing I would add to that is this sort of style of writing in The Economist is intended to be somewhat explanatory. So I would hope that in those sorts of cases, again, like James said, you would say inflation above the target of 2% set by, but I'm sure that there are lots of times where we do not do that. So it's a really good point to bring up, and it's definitely something to think about.
And Johnny, I'll give you the last word.
I think, I mean, it's probably over my head, that question, but in terms of, I think it kind of shows, as I think Owen said, that there's a role for different organizations. ONS can do a lot, but they in terms of communicating economic statistics, they need help from the wider economics community. And I guess in terms of this session as well, that the Economic Observatory is kind of a place that has the potential. They communicate to a wide range of audiences, but they have a huge potential to become a kind of a hub that we as economists can communicate to the public through. And if that's helped by a economics media center, all the better. And my last bit is I'll have a poster in the poster session on these things. So please come and talk to me about these issues.
Oh, as Johnny's done a plug, can I also do a plug? So I'm professionally obliged to tell you all to sign up to our behind the scenes data newsletter called Off the Charts. You can sign up at economist.com off the charts, and it's got really good stuff on how to present data better, how to communicate your data better. I'm sure a few of you, at least a handful maybe, know about it. But yeah, please do sign up. It's great.
Thank you. Right, we will leave it there before they start selling books, their own books, essentially at the front here. Thanks to our collaborators, the Economics Observatory, and thanks very much to the organisers. Thank you very much to the panel. I think we should show our appreciation in the traditional way. And thank you all for coming, and enjoy the posters and I think some drinks in the foyer. Thank you.